I couldn't believe my eyes when I stepped outside that morning. My beloved garden, 15 years of careful cultivation, reduced to nothing but trampled soil and broken stems. The roses my late wife had planted, destroyed. The heritage tomatoes I'd been growing for a decade, uprooted and scattered. And there stood Karen, our HOA president, arms crossed, with that smug little smile on her face. "Perhaps now you'll understand our landscaping standards," she said coldly. But what Karen didn't know, I had a secret weapon that would make her regret the day she touched my garden. I've always been a man of simple pleasures. After 30 years working as a high school biology teacher, I retired to Sycamore Hills, a quiet suburban community where I could finally pursue my passion for gardening full-time. My name is Robert Mitchell, though most people just call me Garden Bob. My wife Sarah and I had planned this retirement together, but cancer took her just 2 months before my retirement party. The garden became my sanctuary, my way of keeping her memory alive through the roses she'd always loved. For 3 years, things were peaceful. My front yard evolved into a vibrant ecosystem of native flowering plants, heirloom vegetables, and carefully tended fruit trees. Neighbors would stop by for gardening advice or to trade cuttings. Local schools even brought students for educational tours of what they called Mr. Mitchell's living classroom. Then everything changed when Sycamore Hills elected a new homeowners association board, headed by Karen Winters. Karen was relatively new to the neighborhood, a former corporate executive who'd moved in just 6 months earlier. Always immaculately dressed in designer pantsuits, with not a hair out of place, she seemed determined to transform our diverse, lived-in community into something from an architectural magazine. Within weeks of taking control, the new HOA board issued a 47-page community standards guide with incredibly specific rules about everything from mailbox height to the exact shade of beige permitted for exterior paint. My first official notice came on a Tuesday morning. Violation: unapproved landscaping design. All front yard plantings must be selected from the approved plants list Appendix C and maintain a uniform height not exceeding 24 inches. I tried reasoning with her, inviting her to walk through the garden and see its ecological benefits, how it provided habitat for beneficial insects, conserved water through careful design, and actually increased property values by creating a unique neighborhood attraction. Karen wasn't interested. "Rules are rules, Mr. Mitchell," she said, barely glancing at the flowering native perennials. "This isn't a botanical garden. It's a residential community with standards." I attended the next HOA meeting, armed with signatures from 23 neighbors who supported my garden. I explained how the garden predated these new regulations and should be grandfathered in as an exception. Karen's response was cutting. "Exceptions lead to chaos, Mr. Mitchell. Either you comply or face escalating fines. Your hobby is affecting everyone's property values." That night, I submitted a formal written request for a variance, complete with a professional landscape architect's assessment of how my garden actually enhanced the neighborhood's appeal. 3 days later, I received a formal denial letter, accompanied by a $150 fine for continued non-compliance and a 30-day notice to remediate all unapproved plantings. Karen had declared war on my garden, but I wasn't going down without a fight. The situation deteriorated rapidly after that first fine. Every week brought new violations and increasingly hostile encounters with Karen. When I installed raised garden beds to make my vegetables more orderly, Karen issued a violation for unapproved structural additions. When I trimmed back some of the taller plants, she cited me for improper green waste disposal because I left a small pile of cuttings to compost temporarily. The fines accumulated: $150, then $300, then $500. Each time, I filed formal appeals, but Karen chaired the appeals committee herself, a clear conflict of interest that she dismissed when I raised the issue. "Perhaps gardening in your backyard would be more appropriate," she suggested during one particularly tense exchange. Though I should mention we're revising the backyard visibility standards next month. I wasn't the only target. Karen's HOA enforcement crusade affected many neighbors. The Rodriguez family was fined for their children's basketball hoop. Miss S. Abernathy, a 78-year-old widow, received violations for wind chimes that were audibly disruptive. The Patels were cited for the scent of spices from their cooking that Karen claimed was affecting the neighborhood olfactory experience. But I seemed to be her special project. Twice, I caught her standing at the edge of my property with a measuring tape and camera, documenting what she called egregious violations. Things reached a new level when Karen began holding neighborhood standards tours where she would lead potential home buyers past my house, pointing out how my garden was bringing down community values and assuring them it would be remediated soon. My neighbors were sympathetic but frightened. "She's ruthless, Bob," my next-door neighbor, Tom, whispered one evening. Last month, she had James's car towed from his own driveway because his registration sticker was one day expired. One day. I tried a new approach compromise. I removed some of the more unconventional plants, installed a decorative low fence to create more structure, and even incorporated some of the approved plants from Karen's ridiculous list. I submitted a new variance request with these concessions clearly outlined. Karen's response came not in writing, but in action. The HOA hired a landscape compliance specialist who parked outside my house daily, taking photos and notes on a clipboard. I began receiving daily violations for increasingly absurd infractions, excessive bee activity, non-uniform growth patterns, and even unapproved bird visitation. The final straw came during a week I spent visiting my daughter after she had surgery. I'd arranged for a neighbor's son to water my garden while I was away. When I returned home, I found an official notice taped to my door, emergency landscaping intervention. Due to continued non-compliance and reports of pest infestation, the HOA has exercised its right under Section 7(3) to enter the property and address community health concerns. I rushed to my front yard and found devastation. My carefully nurtured garden had been decimated. Workers had ripped out nearly everything native plants that had taken years to establish. Sarah's roses, rare heirloom vegetables I'd been saving seeds from for generations. In their place was a uniform layer of bark mulch and a few pathetic groupings of the same boring shrubs that dotted every other HOA-compliant yard. A laminated sign had been planted in the center. Landscape remediation complete violation resolved. Additional charges on next HOA statement. I stood there in shock, holding a broken stem from Sarah's prized Cecile Brunner climbing rose, the one that had been propagated from her grandmother's garden. Tears streamed down my face as the full impact hit me. That's when Karen pulled up in her white Mercedes SUV. She stepped out, designer sunglasses perched on her perfectly highlighted hair, and surveyed the destruction with obvious satisfaction. "Much better," she declared. "The Compliance Committee will inspect again in 30 days to ensure you maintain the approved standard." She handed me an invoice, $4,300 for the emergency remediation services. As she turned to leave, she paused. "Oh, and there's a $750 fine for the unauthorized watering schedule while you were away. Water conservation, you know." Something inside me snapped. But I wasn't going to lower myself to her level with shouting or threats. My response would be far more effective and completely by the book. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the pitiful remains of plants. I'd managed to salvage broken stems, uprooted seedlings, and traumatized perennials. Each one represented years of care and countless memories. The last intact bloom from Sarah's rose sat in a small vase before me. 3 years ago, on her final Mother's Day, our daughter had photographed Sarah smiling weakly beside this same rose bush. "At least they'll bloom for you when I can't anymore," she had whispered to me. Now even that living connection was destroyed. I called my daughter Emily, voice breaking as I described what had happened. "Dad, this is insane," she said. "There have to be limits to what an HOA can do. Have you talked to a lawyer?" I hadn't. Like most retired teachers, my pension covered my needs, but left little room for legal battles. The HOA had deeper pockets and explicit language in their contracts, giving them broad enforcement powers. They knew exactly what they were doing, I replied. Karen made sure to cite their emergency intervention clause. They'll claim garden pests constituted a community health risk. What pests? Your garden was the healthiest ecosystem in the neighborhood. Karen mentioned seeing rats. There weren't any rats, Emily. But by the time that's proven, my garden is already gone. After we hung up, I walked through my barren yard under moonlight, where native bees once buzzed among coniflowers. There was now only sterile mulch. Where butterflies had fluttered around milkweed, there stood a single regulation-approved boxwood. I picked up a handful of soil I'd enriched for years, with compost and care, and let it sift through my fingers. This wasn't just about plants. This was about erasing something deeply personal, something that had kept me going after Sarah died. The next morning, I noticed neighbors slowing as they passed my house, expressions of shock and sympathy on their faces. Miss S. Abernathy actually wept when she saw the destruction. "Your garden brought me so much joy, Robert," she said, clutching my hand with her arthritic fingers. "Every morning, I'd have my coffee by the window, just to watch the hummingbirds in your flowers." By afternoon, neighbors began stopping by. Tom brought coffee. The Rodriguez family delivered a homemade casserole. James arrived with a six-pack of beer and righteous anger. One by one, they shared their own stories of Karen's tyranny, the arbitrary fines, the constant surveillance, the atmosphere of fear she'd created. "She's turned neighbor against neighbor," Miss S. Patel observed. "We're all too afraid to stand up for each other. She can't get away with this," I said finally. "Not just for my garden, but for all of us." That evening, I set up my old laptop at the kitchen table and began documenting every notice, every fine, every interaction with Karen. I photographed my destroyed garden and gathered the before photos showing its previous condition. I dug through old emails and HOA minutes, noting every procedural violation Karen had committed. Past midnight, I created a simple blog titled Garden of Tyranny and uploaded my story with photos and scanned documents. I shared it in our neighborhood's private Facebook group with a simple message: "I thought I was alone. Now I know I'm not." If you've experienced similar treatment, please share your story. It's time we reclaimed our neighborhood. I fell into bed emotionally exhausted, expecting perhaps a few sympathetic comments by morning. I woke to my phone buzzing constantly with notifications. The post had exploded overnight. Neighbors were sharing their own HOA horror stories, uploading their absurd violation notices, and expressing outrage over my garden's destruction. Someone had shared my blog post to a national HOA watchdog group, and it was gaining traction far beyond our community. By noon, local news had picked up the story. A reporter stood in front of my mulch-covered yard, describing the beloved community garden that had been eradicated without warning. They showed before and after photos that made the destruction look even more shocking than it felt. Mid-video CTA. If you've ever faced an unreasonable HOA or had someone destroy something you loved, type justice in the comments below. Let's show that we stand together against this kind of bullying. I never expected what happened next. My phone rang that afternoon, a local attorney named Michael Zhang, who specialized in property rights. "Mr. Mitchell, I've seen your story," he said. "What the HOA did was illegal on multiple levels. I'd like to represent you pro bono." Michael explained that while HOAs have significant powers, they aren't unlimited. Karen had violated several state laws, entering my property without proper notice, destroying personal property, holding enforcement meetings without required transparency, and retaliating against residents who filed appeals. "But the most actionable issue," Michael continued, "is the environmental ordinance violation. Your county passed a Native Plant Protection Act last year that specifically prevents the removal of established pollinator habitats. Did you register your garden under that program?" I had. Sarah and I had registered our garden years ago with the county's Ecological Preservation Initiative. I'd even posted the small certification sign which Karen's crew had thrown away during their remediation. "That's what I thought," Michael said. "The HOA just violated county environmental law. We can file for an emergency injunction today." Within hours, I was standing before a judge alongside Michael, presenting evidence of the ecological damage and regulatory violations. Karen was there too, flanked by the HOA's attorney, looking considerably less confident than usual. The judge granted our emergency injunction, barring the HOA from any further actions against my property and ordering a full investigation into their practices. But the real twist came when we returned to the courthouse parking lot. Mr. Mitchell called a woman approaching us. "I'm Eleanor Reeves, County Environmental Compliance Officer. We've been monitoring your case with great interest." She handed me an official-looking document. "This is a citation for the HOA, and personally for Miss Winters for violation of the Endangered Species Protection Statute." I was confused. Endangered species? In my garden? Eleanor smiled. "The Mitchell's prairie clover, a rare native plant presumed extinct in this region until your garden was certified as a recovery site 3 years ago. According to our records, you had the only documented specimen in the county." I remembered the unassuming plant Sarah had been so excited when the university botanist identified it during a community science project. "The destruction of an endangered species habitat carries significant penalties," Eleanor continued. "We've already begun our investigation." Karen's face had turned ashen as the environmental officer explained the potential $50,000 fine and criminal charges for knowingly destroying protected habitat. "I didn't know," she stammered. "Nobody told me about any endangered plants." "The certification was clearly posted," Eleanor replied coolly. "And according to multiple witnesses, Mr. Mitchell specifically mentioned the protected status of his garden plants during HOA meetings. We have the minutes." As Karen stood there speechless, neighbors began gathering. News had spread about our court victory. Tom patted my shoulder. Miss S. Abernathy held up her phone, showing dozens of supportive messages in our neighborhood group. Karen finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous. I was enforcing community standards. The board will back me up on this." That's when another twist arrived in the form of an email to all residents. The HOA board had called an emergency session and voted to suspend Karen from her position pending investigation into potential abuses of authority and violations of state law. Karen's carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling around her. Her perfect enforcement record now looked like a pattern of harassment, her community standards revealed as personal vendettas. As she stormed off to her Mercedes, she turned back with one last threat. "This isn't over, Mitchell." I looked at my neighbors standing united, at Michael's confident smile, at Eleanor's official citation, and at the media cameras capturing it all. "Actually, Karen," I called after her, "I believe it is." The following weeks brought one victory after another. The county investigation expanded beyond my garden to examine all of Karen's HOA enforcement actions. They found numerous violations of state law, including selective enforcement, procedural irregularities, and retaliatory actions against residents who questioned her authority. At a special community meeting, the remaining HOA board members resigned, enabling new elections. Our neighborhood elected a diverse group of longtime residents who promised transparency and reasonable enforcement. Their first official act was to revise the community guidelines, explicitly protecting established gardens and ending what they called the aesthetic homogeneity mandate. The environmental authorities required the HOA's insurance to cover full restoration of my garden as a protected habitat. University botanists helped replant native species, including carefully cultivated offspring from my original Mitchell's prairie clover that had been preserved in their greenhouse program. Karen tried to fight the citations and fines, but eventually settled both the county charges and my private lawsuit. The terms remained confidential, but included funds for creating a community garden space named in Sarah's memory. The most satisfying moment came on a warm Saturday morning, when neighbors gathered for a garden replanting party. Everyone brought plants to share cuttings from their own gardens, native seedlings, and even a rose bush from Mrs. Abernathy that she had apparently propagated from a cutting of Sarah's rose she had received years earlier. As dozens of hands worked together to rebuild what had been destroyed, I noticed a for sale sign being hammered into the lawn of Karen's house. She was moving away, unable to face the community she had tried to control. That evening, as fireflies began to dance above the newly planted garden, Miss Abernathy raised a toast with her lemonade to Bob, who taught us that sometimes standing your ground means letting things grow. Karen thought she could uproot my garden and crush my spirit, but she never expected that destroying those plants would plant seeds of community resistance instead. If you believe Karen got exactly what she deserved, type garden justice in the comments below. I'd love to hear your own stories of standing up to unreasonable HOAs or neighbors who tried to control what wasn't theirs to control. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of everyday heroes fighting back against petty tyranny and winning. Hit the notification bell to see our next video. They towed my car off my driveway, so I became HOA president and rewrote all the rules. Remember, sometimes justice takes time to bloom, but the results are always worth it.